Today I get to speak with Nicole Bates, Yogiraj Charles Bates, and Vina Prather's firstborn. I have had the great pleasure of being here for a few weeks, and this morning we got together. We are looking at republishing Pigs Eat Wolves together, and so we had our meeting that we've been having for a couple of years now, and we started reading out loud some of the content that we're going to be putting into the third edition. I've asked Nicole if she would please read a little bit of it for us, and then I have a few questions about her work in education and the way in which she works with mistake making and translating that over into medical care. Nicole, thank you for taking this time. So read to us that paragraph that started this conversation for us, if you would, please.
Yeah. So we were reading. What I want you to pay attention to, however, is that it was not only his recognizing the mistake, but the act of revising that is important. He used his error as an invitation to explore, instead of ashamedly writing the whole thing off as a bad dream. He stepped into the unknown and dangerous path of the wronged woman, whose candy bar he had self-righteously eaten. He was on the threshold of an important domain of learning, and he was using error as an invitation to exploration and growth. And so this morning, when we were talking about this, it really put me in mind of how I would operate in the classroom when I was working with my students. And in all honesty, I do it even in the professional development that I do with the adults. And I really try to frame mistakes or error as a really rich opportunity for learning. So, I'm a family and consumer science teacher, and a couple of the lab classes that I would teach would be culinary arts and clothing tech. And so in the sewing class, I really tried to emphasize to my students, your best friend is the seam ripper. And that by making mistakes and then taking them apart and having an opportunity to reassemble them, you really, you get to learn what's working and what's not working. You get to learn what doesn't work. And then you don't just stop there at being told you're wrong, but you have an opportunity to unmake it and then remake it correctly. And that caution and that care with the remaking, I feel is a really important learning opportunity for learners. And one of the things that is so remarkable is how well that really can internalize the learning. And so another instance I was sharing was in my culinary arts classes, and how I would tell my students right at the very beginning that they needed to be prepared, that any mistakes made were beautiful learning opportunities, and to not take it personally and not be offended when a mistake would be made by their particular lab group. And I was going to let it be a learning opportunity for everyone. And so I would call attention to it and then talk through what happened and how that mistake happened, and then what they learned from that with the whole class, not as a way of shaming or punishing folks, but as a way of helping them to learn and then to redo and learn correctly, right? And so a story that I often shared with my students was that I remember when I was in middle school, young teenager, and I made some banana bread. And because I had added the baking soda or baking powder with the wet ingredients, it didn't get really well mixed in. And so when eating the bread, you'd get all of these little bites of bitterness from the leavening agent, the baking soda or baking powder. I don't remember which, but I do remember that bitter taste. And from that, to this day, some 40 years later, I always pre-mix my dry ingredients really thoroughly because I don't want any lumps or chunks. And it's such a crystal clear memory to me. And I learned so much that I don't have shame around the mistake that I made. But it taught me to be very intentional in how I bake now. But also it's giving me a really rich example to give to my students of how they are going to learn from mistakes. And so another piece that I would often like to do is give my students an opportunity to do things that intentionally show them what happens when they fail or when they're not following directions, so that they can learn what it looks like when things don't turn out the way you want them to, and then to not be afraid. Like, that's the biggest thing, is to not feel shame and fear around mistakes. Now, I know in the medical profession there's maybe think there's a lot more at stake. But I'm going to tell you, as an educator in a public school,
there was a lot
at stake because I had a very limited budget, so we couldn't be wasting ingredients. And so it wasn't that I wanted my students to be cavalier, but there was always something very particular that they needed to learn. And I wanted them to understand that their mistakes are beautiful learning opportunities.
One of the things that stands out for me about that is that, yes, in a medical environment, when a mistake is made, often the harm that can come from that mistake might be more quickly evident, and it might be extremely evident quickly. But I don't think we think about the long-term impact on a child's mind, heart, spirit, the delayed impact, the systemic impact.
Yeah.
So I understand that comment that will, maybe somebody in the medical field might be thinking, oh, well, we have to have a little bit of shame in order to make sure that people understand how critically important it is. But the bottom line is that we're not learning that way.
Right.
And we are preventing learning from happening because people aren't speaking up when a mistake is made. And so I really wanted you to hear from Nicole today about that, because I think that in the medical field and in the education specifically, that's an area that is important. And I know there are a number of curriculums. I've worked on some of those curriculums that have embedded in it a far more receptivity to airing mistakes. Nicole, I'm wondering if you'd be willing to answer just a few more questions. I'm doing a montage.
Okay.
There are 3 questions, and you have something to add.
I actually want to add one more
Please.
example from really recently.
Great.
So I've been sewing and making masks, right? And I'm having young people sew with me. And there is one young woman. She's 13 years old, and she's been sewing with me, but she goes to a school, a language immersion school, where there's a lot of shame in the culture if students get things wrong. And different people have different levels of resiliency, but feeling like she's made a mistake is really, really a hard thing for her to handle. And so I've been working with her because she took some cut fabric out, some pattern pieces home, and put together some masks. And so we're making the learning masks are the ones that we're using for donations. And when she brought them back, they were all put together upside down. So they were not put together in the way that they were intended to be done. And I asked her to redo one of them. And so she took that with the next batch of masks that she took to sew. And we really kind of went through what she needed to do correctly. But then when she had the opportunity to both take it apart and then put it back together with the new information that she had, she did a beautiful job of reassembling that one. And then she had the other new ones that she was able to assemble after that. And the learning that she had the opportunity to do, rather than shut down because she hadn't done it right, has been incredibly impactful for her. She's still struggling with this idea that she made a mistake, and she doesn't want to disappoint me. And my conversation with her is continuing to be, you know what? You know how to make a mask better now than you did before because you had an opportunity to go back and correct it. And just thinking about what that learning is.
Yeah.
And so,
Thank you. And I really appreciate that you had that insight to help her regain some of that confidence. You and I were talking a lot about a lot of people who experienced your father experienced conversations with him as though they were the only thing important to him in that moment. And a lot of people felt that way. I wanted to ask you if you would just share a memory that pops up for you that you'd like to share about your dad. And then I want to ask you a couple more questions specifically about the way in which he died, if it's okay with you.
yes, absolutely.
Great. So what's a memory? Tell us a memory about you and your dad.
Okay, so I was telling Vivi about how amazing it was to have him as my father and to be in conversations with him. And I felt like he always really saw me and listened to me. And I always felt like what I had to say was important from the time I was a very little child. So I was probably 3 or 4 years old. And I remember having a conversation with him about this recurring dream that I had. And I remember how seriously he took me in that conversation. So the dream is of me flying through space. And I'm flying through space with the objective, and I'm flying like, Superman, through space with the objective of finding God. Because I really want to discover God. But what I had decided was that the way that I could actually know that God was real, that I actually needed to find God's grandma. All right.
Interesting.
Right. And so here I am just flying through space, looking for God and God's grandma. And I come upon this wall, this brick wall in the middle of space. And I can't quite get up over it. But I know that I can hear God and God's grandma chuckling about the fact that I'm trying to find them and can't get to them on the other side of the wall. And so this is a recurring dream that I had when I was a little child, 3 or 4 years old. And I remember talking with him about it. Do I remember what he said? No. But I remember my experience of being listened to by this adult that I loved, honored, and respected. And it was, I think part of the reason that I remember this dream is that it was an important dream. And he took me very seriously and talked about how important this dream was. And so that's like one really vivid example. I have other examples, but that's one really vivid one.
I'm going to put those memories into a montage, and I'll be showing it to legislators and administrators of hospitals to introduce your father from many different lenses. As you know, I've spoken many, many times about him and the way that he died. And I don't feel like I've given the hologram effect of him because it's just my view, right? And so I'm really excited for people to get to know him through other people's lenses, and especially his kids' lenses. I wanted to ask you, Nicole, if you had heard about medical errors causing harm or death before your father died.
I don't know that I was really very aware of it. it wasn't on my radar. I mean, I think I knew about it, but it was a very abstract thing.
Yeah.
It was not like in my, I mean, I couldn't even fathom that could, that it could be medical, that medical errors could lead to Dad's death. Yeah, that wasn't on my radar.
I know in speaking with people who have had experiences like our family has, that they say very similar things. It's incomprehensible until it's right before your eyes. And as you know, one of the reasons that I'm zigzagging from Southern California to DC is to help everyday people not have to experience it directly in order to have that aha moment. My invitation to people is the aha. You don't have to experience it yourself in order to wake up to the fact that it is happening.
Right.
And even if you're a clinician who's seeing it every day, you don't have to have the story of somebody like Yogiraj or the Bates family describe their experience before you decide not to let it just be something that happens, but to actually pick up the tools that we know exist to intervene on it.
Right.
So my last question for you is, can you imagine your next appointment with a clinician, nurse, a doctor, a holistic practitioner, and just looking them in the eye and saying something in your own words to the effect of, let's make sure that we're united to make sure this medical care is safe. United in that it's their responsibility and it's also your responsibility. Okay. Can you imagine that? And if not, tell me what you can imagine.
So I can, and it's actually a really nice idea because I know I've actually recently switched my primary care person at my clinic. And it's that the primary person, she wasn't doing anything negligent or wrong. I just had not felt quite as taken seriously. And I had some medical issues last fall. And because it was all kind of like coming up very quickly, I had to see a lot of different clinicians at the same clinic because, you see who you can. And from that experience, I had an opportunity to really see a couple of different folks at the same clinic and found another person who I intentionally sought them out for the next few appointments or for the next little while. And then it was this spring, I had pneumonia, walking pneumonia. And we weren't, it was during COVID, so we weren't able to go in. And it was probably a good thing because I would have been incredibly susceptible. And at that point, I asked, I had a little conversation with my clinician, and I said, I've had a good experience these last few times that I've met with you. So I would like to change to you as my primary care physician. And so I feel like that was me like entering into relationship and partnership. But I really like the idea of, let's make sure that this is safe. And I really try to seek out physicians who can do what my dad did. And that's to listen to me, to honor my intelligence, to actually believe that I can be included in my healthcare decisions. And I don't engage well with people who don't do that. So And I have really good experiences when I find physicians who can do that, who engage me in that and give me enough information so I can go and learn more and take my learning, seriously, and my questions really seriously. So, yeah.
I love how you bring it back full circle to that moment of, just what I think what most of us want is to be heard, to be seen, I know that we'll have more time to talk. Thank you for taking this time today, and thank you for listening to Nicole and talk about her dad, and also talk about her experience in education and how the approach of not bringing shame into the equation increases the ability and the capacity for people to actually own their mistakes quickly, which then, of course, interrupts the repetition of that error. And whether it's in education or a police precinct or a governance or a hospital or a long-term care facility, that can make all of the difference. Thanks for taking the time again. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you. This was fun. All right.